Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Margie Serrato. I combine my expertise in culture, psychology, as well as philosophies in the personal growth and professional growth industries. And I do all of this in combination with each other to help my clients and my audiences to dismantle cultural beliefs in order to embrace our whole selves.
And hello, I am Kalyan Gadamsetti. I'm your co-host. I combine my expertise in sciences and also philosophy. And also mainly I look into the physical, mental, and also spiritual aspects of humanity in general.
So follow us, make sure to connect with us on social media, send us any comments or questions that you have so that we can continue the conversation. Today's topic is going to be on culture and society. Basically, how does culture and society affect our mindset? And in order to do that, we have to first define what is culture and what is society. So when we think about culture, our culture shapes our perception of the world and it shapes our values. It influences our mindset, which in turn affects how we interact with others, how we interact with our environment, how we make decisions, how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. It is also the conditioning and the things that we learn early on that shapes our goals, shapes our ambitions, shapes our approach to problem solving, shapes our institutions that we operate on every day. Everything from how we understand marriage to how we understand work and what we think is ideal or acceptable in any variety of ways. Our culture also influences attitudes. It influences our beliefs. It influences behaviors. So when we think about culture, it's basically in anthropology classes, I would always say culture is basically how we think, how we act, how we feel. And it's a very basic definition, but it is very important to everything that we do. So, with that in mind, and thinking about culture on one hand, we also think about society. Kalyan, how would you describe that difference between culture and society?
No, Margie, I think you put it very, very aptly before. For me, culture actually is what starts within the family itself. Like within, it could be a big family or small family, right? And you touched on anthropology, and the aspect for me is when human beings started to adapt a culture. We have different groups of people coming together and forming, like, you talk about villages, small towns and cities, right? And this together eventually becomes a city. But what everything, the values, the way a human being responds to each other in terms of expectations, in terms of relationships, everything starts within the family itself. So I always say this: the culture reflects back to oneself within how they were upbringing, and how it evolves through generations. You probably see that, and one example here is, you take an example of Asian cultures, long history of heritage, right? And you almost see that, like, from generations and generations, a like a mom passes her the way a daughter should be brought up, right? And you see that reflected in like 4 or 5 generations, exact footprint. So it's so interesting to watch culture for me in that perspective. And when you see these cultures bring together, and that's where the magic happens, like bring together in one town or one location. Take an example of New York City, right? You have a multi-dimension of cultures, and that's when they call that, hey, we have a bigger city here, like a bigger society here. But it still goes back to, like, what is African American culture doing in that city, right? It goes back to what is a Hispanic culture doing in that city, what is Indian people doing in that city. So it it is a culture, a multi-dimensional culture, but still enveloped within the bigger society. So pretty much in a summary.
Yeah, one thing that I was just thinking of is when we think the big differentiator is culture goes with us wherever we go. whereas society is the place that we end up going into, right? So society is static. It stays where it is. It's generally dependent on a geographic, let's say, location, right? Society in the US is going to be different than society in Colombia, than different to society in India. And that has its own dynamic for how it changes over time or doesn't, what things change and what things don't. But culture is something that is internalized. So even though collectively in a place we have these agreed upon like social norms, that we all collectively behave in such a way that is conforming to a shared idea or a shared belief about how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to act, the things we're supposed to say or not say, is also something that when we learn those things from the time that we are born, we also take that with us to other places, to other societies. So then when, in the example that you just gave, when you are from India, but then you come to the United States, or you go to Colombia, or do you find people from India, and how have the people who are originally from India or have Indian heritage, how do they adapt to the new society? And what things do they bring from their old, from their previous society? And how do they mix these different things? And how do you determine what things are acceptable or not? And it's such a beautiful combination of things. It depends greatly on who makes that new culture, right? Or that new microculture within that larger society. So there's a lot of different dynamics, right? There's the individual, the collective, and then there's a larger, systems as well, which is fascinating to see how culture can be slow culture or fast culture. If you think of trends and fashions, that's fast culture. That's culture changing at a pace that is much, much faster than, let's say, changing our ideas about sexuality or marriage or, any number of different things, right?
Yeah, I think since you mentioned that, it's so fascinating to see how the world is shaping up, right? We always talk about wherever you live outside of United States, the Western influence, right, catching up in other countries. So it is almost seamlessly happening throughout the generations that we adapt that kind of Western influence in most of the societies nowadays. For me, it just that advancing, and I'm going to bring up this one, right? Technology, advancing technology, individualism, creating your own identity, branding yourself. So these are becoming more and more important from a individual human being standpoint. I'm not even referring to culture, but individual human being within a certain family is trying to be more expressive. So in that sense, once it becomes like a standard expectation within that society, and this is going to translate across continents somewhere, and that's where you see that pop culture like hip hop and music, or Hollywood, it's going to come because there is more creativity, more imagination, right? And I think that's what transcends into different cultures, even though they are far away, thousands of miles away. So it's so beautiful to watch that that culture actually can spread from one continent to another continent.
Absolutely. And you're right. Technology, completely has changed the things that the way that culture changed before to a much, much faster, but also more complex way, because suddenly we have in this technological space, people from so many different backgrounds and thoughts and beliefs that are trying to also kind of generate new ideas, but still holding on to some of the old ideas. And how do you do that in such a way that, when we think about respecting, other people's beliefs and respecting other people's way of life, but you're holding on to your own way of life being better or being the right way, or however you perceive that, it makes creating new ideas a little bit of a challenge because you have to let go. You have to detach yourself from a little bit from the things that you've staunchly held as true in order to create something that is new and possibly better, right? So there's that process of unlearning your own cultural conditioning. And I think a lot of, when you move from one country to another, and it's not even necessary to move from one country to another. It could be like, for example, in the United States, moving from one city to another. If you're in a bigger country, moving from rural to, to a more, like the big city, for example, something that I know a lot of us can, no matter where in the world we're from, we have these perceptions about people in the big city being a certain way versus people out in the country being a certain way. So even those small, very human things, right? The human ways in which we differentiate ourselves from somebody else, it plays a role in much bigger scale when we're adding so many other people from so many different places. And so there's even small changes going from the country to the big city. There are certain things that, in the big city, people do things a little differently, and you have to negotiate with yourself, like with your own identity. Like, what does this mean if I adopt this, or what does this mean if I actually think this is better? Does it mean that I'm turning my back on my family, on my traditions, on my, on my or my heritage? There are a lot of implications for us as individuals when we start examining, what does this mean to me, and what does it mean about me if I choose to change my thinking.
I think this is fantastic, right? The point you're trying to make it is identifying your, I guess, identifying your own identity, how it's shaping up with the culture. And let me bring an important topic here, point here on that aspect, because once you are kind of deviating and you know that you're deviating from the culture, and that particular society can see a person as, maybe for a lack of a better word, it's an outcast, or because you're kind of differentiating, you're probably outperforming or maybe underperforming, but it is your own identity kind of telling you, hey, I need to grow up, I need to grow into different dimension, right? And I think that is where one has to probably stand in the truth for how they want to express themselves, and then probably bring forward several other people into that dimension, and that they can be the breakthrough for that culture, right? um, so a fantastic point on that.
Another point that it makes me think too is, when because you and I talk about, and it's not just us, but in this case, like, we brought up like being your authentic self and making choices for you, right? The going back to, like, who am I as an individual? Who am I as a person? Who is my being, right? And how do I disentangle that from who I learned to be, who I learned I was supposed to be? How do you talk to people about that? How do you bring up this, if somebody says, well, who am I? How do I even figure that out? What is the path that you give them to do?
I think it is something that human beings, every human being has to find that deeper exploration within themselves. It's a continuous process of finding their true nature. This is what I call, when people ask me that question, who am I, that identity is a pretty, I call it as something you're looking at a single point of a needle, because it could change depending on environmental factors. Maybe a situation like COVID or something hits a family of four people, which we have seen that devastating. But it could change how the culture of that particular family, and then eventually the society is shaping up, right? So short answer to that from me is exploring for yourself and being open to that transformation within yourself, adapting to that new ways of how your inner nature is telling you. I think that's what is gonna shape the humanity going forward. Not being caught up with the some old ways of thinking, traditional ways of thinking. We always get into that thing, right? Like, oh, this is me, this is me, this is my identity. But then, yes, it is you for now, but in 5 years you're gonna have a baby, or you're gonna be a mom or a dad. You're gonna change. We know that they're gonna change. So in that sense, so identity is never, for me, it's always a continuous process of a change. And our finding our own inner nature is 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 far more important than how a culture or a society is shaping up. So it's more observation and then finding yourself to merge into that society.
I love that. I will add that when people ask me that, like, well, where do I even start figuring out who I am? If who I am now is so entrenched in the cultural ideology and conditioning that I grew up with, that we all do, like, how do you start taking apart the part, the different pieces to figure out who you actually are at your core? And I know you and I have talked about having, awakenings, and just, to me, it's such a beautiful word, because it's like waking up to yourself. And that can happen in different ways. I feel like COVID, actually, now that you mention it, COVID was one of those massive disruptions to our day-to-day, mundane, routine, autopilot life. It was a big enough disruption for a lot of people to stop and think, is this what I want to do with my life? Is this what life is? Just going to work and getting a paycheck, or living with this person? Like, we know that there are a lot of relationships that did not make the pandemic, did not make it through, because if you already had existing challenges, and now you're suddenly with this person the whole time, and you can't escape them, that can feel very traumatic, first of all. But it also can make you just really question, like, is this the person that I want to be with? If I can't even be in the same space with the person and feel good with this person, what does that mean for me? And it is especially challenging if you were married, because then it means, well, what does that mean for me as a married person? Or what does it mean about my identity if I have determined that this is not good for me, and that I would be better off on my own? And then you add kids to the mix, so that it can be more and more complex. And in that situation, the awakening came from a place of complete disruption that is outside of any of our control. But there are other ways in which that can happen. Divorce, a breakup, right? Relationships that we've become people we've become attached to is another way. When that no longer is there, and you've become your identity has been subsumed in the relationship, seeing yourself as an individual person is, can be really hard, because everything was about you together, right? So that's another way. I feel like for people who've been through graduate school, finishing graduate school, and you feel like you finished school, but you finish without an ounce of energy to do anything else, and you stop and think, was this worth it? That can be another one, right? So there's lots of different life experiences, difficulties, that can bring about this existential question of, who am I? And is this all there is to life? And I don't want that to be my life. Well, can I do anything about it? And just feeling lost with all of those big questions. And so when I've been asked before, how do I learn who I am? It made me reflect on, well, how did I learn who I am? Like, in these different awakenings that I've had, what were the things that I did? And in the last one, I had to kind of really get basic and go, what do I know about myself? What are the things that I feel are, this is me to my core? And I thought, okay, let's just start from there. And so I thought, I'm a Leo. I was born on August 21st. I am staunchly a Leo. I have this fiery, courageous, just strong sense of where I am and what I'm meant to do. And I am a natural leader, even when I don't want to be, even when I'm hiding in the background and trying to just observe, and I'm always in the spotlight. I was like, okay, that's a very Leo thing. That feels like something that I learned about myself versus something that my family or my society or my culture taught me that is who I am. In fact, in a way, it's even counter to what we learn, because in my own family, like, horoscopes is basically witchcraft. So it's that one in particular. I thought, oh, this is definitely me and something that I find is part of my identity, because it reflects a part of who I am that feels very true to me, even when there's a challenge with it. But at the same time, it's definitely not culture, because horoscopes is not something that my culture does, right? So there is a very clear distinction in that particular way. Another way was learning what my name means. So I always, when my mom, Margie is not a Colombian name, okay? It is, it's not a name that's been in my family or anything. So it's very unique to me. And I remember being little and asking my mom, why did you name me that? And she told me, she's like, there's this person in my life who, she helped me a lot when, she helped me to free myself. And that was important to me. And I thought, okay, I could see that, right? That's fair. that's a good reason to name your child a certain name. And I also knew that the root of Margie is Margaret, which means pearl. And so I always had this idea of like, okay, pearl, right? It's a rare gem. It is also formed under intense pressure, which my life experiences were like, yeah, that's pretty accurate. But then, so a few years ago, when I went back and I looked at, okay, what's my name? What's the meaning of my name? And just wanted to confirm that for myself, I actually found, yes, pearl is the definition, but there was an alternate one. And another meaning of my name that I did not know is child of light. And I had this sense when I learned that I was not meant to know that before. I don't know what I wouldn't have understood how meaningful that definition was. I wouldn't have understood at a cosmic, soulful level why that actually mattered. And I was so deep in my own personal development and my growth and my inner healing that it made me realize, okay, this is why people always say you're so magnetic and you have this like energy that, just like shines through you. I never understood that. And I thought, this is very interesting. This is okay. This is who I am. I may not like it because it feels strange for me to be in the spotlight. And that's my conditioning. We can talk about that another day, but it made me realize this is my path. It's always been my path. I was an educator before. That is sharing my light, right? My knowledge, my wisdom with others. So I feel like at a very basic level, there are things that we know about ourselves, but we haven't firmly grasped necessarily like the depth of what that means for us. And so my advice would be, start with the simple things and dig a little deeper on the things that you believe you already know about yourself, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think so beautiful, so beautiful. The maybe I can add a little bit from my perspective. What I can relate to is, it almost feels like we're going back to the childhood how we were experiencing the wonder, right? I've always watched stars sleeping on the top of the building. Like, there are open in India back, there are open, you could probably go up to the rooftop and sleep there. So I was fascinated by watching stars. So, and then I've always a guy who wants to smile and laugh and have a lot of parties and singing and a lot of friendships. So it almost feels like sometimes when you're busy with work and lifestyle, again, talking about culture, where you live in that society, you lose that essence in a way, because you get caught up in the rat race we call, right? You got to work on building the American dream or mortgage or, payments and this. So you lose that sense of wonder you have as a kid. But then I think once you get to that middle age, again, very fortunate to have the deep awakening experience, like telling me back, go back to your roots of who you are, you know. And I think that's where, for me, that culture speaks to. Like, it's almost like you take you plant a seed and you develop the plant every day, you put the water in and you have the roots formed. Those roots are very strong. So that's how I see the culture. Like, most of us, whether you come from Africa or maybe Australia or India or Mexico, you see that people at maybe a teenage level, or even when they get into 20s, they have a strong cultural foundation within them. They haven't worked in any companies or anything, but they still bring that strong culture because the roots have been established. So in a way, for me, it feels that one cannot totally get out of thinking differently. Even because your roots have formed, you have to behave in certain way as much as your upbringing was, right? The way you talk, the way you express yourself, the emotions, those come naturally because the culture has is the seed which is actually shaping up to behave this way. So it's almost so beautiful to watch, for me myself, observing while I'm speaking to you, like how my hands are moving, how my expression is. It's everything I relate back to where I was grown up. It's almost difficult to disassociate from the from that nature.
Absolutely. I completely understand that. And my relation to that comment is I was born and raised here in the United States. I only lived in Colombia for 6 years. And yet my English has an accent. And you think, but I've been here all my life. And so why is that? Well, it's because I learned to speak English from my parents, from my mom, from her family. We have an accent, right? They have an accent because they were, the first ones to come here to the United States. And I learned that accent from her. And it's unconscious. It's very, it's just how we learned. And even though I don't hear it in myself when I speak, and people will ask, like, where are you from? Which is like a source of annoyance because I'm like, I don't hear it. I don't know what you hear. When I record myself, that's when I hear it and I go, oh my gosh, that really is heavy. Or heavier than I certainly expect. But it's because that's part of my own seed, right? That's part of my roots, my culture, this is that first generation way in which the language, the English language, was transferred to me, right? And so it's like you can't do anything about it. And there's no need for you to do anything about it, is the other thing. And I know that's a source of great frustration for a lot of first generation Americans, or like immigrants, is because our language, the way that we speak, betrays us as an outsider, right? As somebody who wasn't, born and raised here, for example. And that can have a lot of implications as far as like our sense of belonging, if somebody identifies us as not being from here, right? So part of, all of that to say, like, one of the things that I always tell everybody, and when I was teaching anthropology, I urged my students, I said, travel, go to a different place from yours. You don't have to go to another country. You can go to another state. You can go to another city. Go and observe how people behave. Go and observe what people do. Go and observe how people talk. And through that, you can build a practice of looking at different ways of being, right? That are very much rooted in culture, right? But then also get to have a point of comparison for saying, this is different than my culture, not to judge it, but simply to discern what are the differences and how do I feel about it? What is the reaction that I'm getting from this? And what have I learned to believe about my way being the right way? You know, to me, part of what I love about that is it allows us to start building awareness about our own biases at the same time that we get to start building empathy and awareness and understanding for others, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe a little bit of different direction, if I can take this topic. I was reading through some of the articles, and I'm fascinated by some of the Japanese culture. Right, they have an island called Okinawa, I think, where they have centenarians like above 100. So I was thinking, like, okay, the culture is that you would have to plant your own crops, make your own food, and then at the night you are all together, the community is together, you're dancing in the fire, and you're enjoying, you're helping each other. In the morning you're just harvesting crop and cooking and eating, and therefore you're the place where they were living, they have the highest centenarians, which is above 100
Mhm.
years old, right? So longevity, right? So it tells us culture is so critical, like how a human life, the longevity, the vitality, the happiness you create, it's all foundation from the culture itself. And now there are several research and studies going to that site and trying to explore and understand how it works. Imagine the world we're living in, so fast paced with internet, and we have chat GPT now giving us all the answers and documents ready in hand. Um, and yet we are talking about like what is important to a human being, right? And it starts with adopting that mindset, being open to other cultures, right? Far away in Japan and Asian, but still understanding from what is happening there. Can I bring something, a drop of their understanding to my life and increase my vitality, my longevity on this planet? So it's just that dimension, shifting that perspective and not being open to other cultures as well, and whatever works for you, right?
Right.
And that can kind of transform a human being a great deal. And that's so monumental shift from how one can bring in one's culture to how one can explore different aspects, what can work for them in their life. What is your thoughts about that perspective, like understanding different cultures and then adopting into your culture?
So, but this is where I love it, because this is where we go from culture, right? From the things that we learned, the ideologies that were instilled in us that are completely, I would say the word that wants to come up is completely unconscious. It was not a conscious agreement. We did not consciously agree to having this set of beliefs, or believing in this God, or thinking that women should do this and men should do that, or believing that a certain partnership, it needs to be a man and a wife. Like all of these different things, right? These are all things that we learned, and we learned depending on how we learned them and who we learned them from. We have very like huge attachment, like very staunch, and my body immediately wants to do this because we have such firm grip on these beliefs and we believe that they're true and there's only one way, and we judge everyone and everything against that which we learned, right? And we learned it. It was conditioned. It is like a brainwashing, right? And we think of brainwashing as being a bad thing. Brainwashing doesn't have to be good or bad. It can be very neutral. It can just be this the way that we learn to be, right? To conform, because as human beings, our survival has depended, like as a species, has depended on belonging and community and surviving together, right? Collective, not the individual. But we're so past that point, and yet belonging is still so ingrained in us. And so then we take something like those firm beliefs that we have, and we are unable to see our individual self outside of that collective learning, right? But really, as human beings, we each have the power and the choice, right, to adapt our thinking and our way of life in whatever myriad possibilities there are. And part of that is I get to choose what I believe. What do I believe about marriage? What do I believe about sexuality? What do I believe about gender? What do I believe? I get to decide. But I first have to understand, what did I learn to believe? And kind of reverse engineer from there and go, okay, what are the values that are actually compatible with who I am? What are the values that I learned? Are the values that I hold true to myself? Are they compatible with the things that I learned? So, right, there's a lot of, I feel like, uncomfortable conversations with ourselves and uncomfortable learning when we realize this doesn't actually match up. And this is probably why I feel such resistance about it. It's not necessarily that I think this way of being or this way of being is wrong. It's that I have not found clarity within myself to determine why I have resistance.
Yeah.
Right? So it's that internal part is what our bodies are telling us, like are signaling, like there's a problem here and you need to fix it. And it's not necessarily to fix with the outside world or with other people. It's to fix within ourselves, to
It's almost,
find that resolution within ourselves.
yeah, I was saying it almost feels like an experiential feeling. Unless you have that experiential feeling, you will not adopt it, or you meaning your body will not adopt it, your mind will not process it, unless you have that experience, right? And something what I witnessed over the last few months is I was traveling in Switzerland. In the morning, I woke up and 4 o'clock in the morning and 4:30, and I went for a run. I was exactly doing the same thing what I was doing here, just to see how my body will be adapting to that. And it's a fantastic experience. So it's just that we almost hesitant to think that, oh, it's a vacation or it's a business trip or something. Why don't we relax? But then something in me is telling that why we cannot maintain our daily routine, right? And that speaks to, like, individually experientially feeling it outside of the culture itself or outside of the society itself. I've done the same thing when I went to Mexico, like waking up in the morning and go for a run. Same thing in India. As my flight landed in India, just go in the morning and go for a run. But then what I've observed is that each time I'm doing the same patterns, whatever it works for me, it just inherently feels that this is me, this is my identity. And culture, for example, my parents or relatives or people may say that, oh, why are you eating so less food? Why can't you have more food? Because it's culture, right?
Yeah.
The tradition is you love the people you love. Well, you love the people you love because of food, the way you have you dress up, and the way you talk, the way you're grown up, um, the way you care for each other. So that automatically comes through different choices we give for others and ourselves. But then your own identity is can change because what you've adapted from different cultures. So that's where the beauty lies in. Like, you have to almost come stronger and tell, hey, this is me. I'm changing. Maybe not the way you may like it or not, but this brings me joy on what I am. So just, giving that perspective of breaking out of culture sometimes, still using the best part of the culture, what works for you and works not, but then standing out and saying, hey, this is me. It's like a small flower all of a sudden popping up and saying, hey, just watch me. I'm smiling, I'm glowing, kind of thing.
No, I like that because it takes a lot of courage for you to stand in your own beliefs and in your own identity when it is different from what you learned, right? Because there's this fear, right? And it's a very say primitive fear of being outcast, of being uh disassociated from the people and the things that you grew up with and feel comfortable with and still love, right? But that you can also hold your love for these things and these people, and understand where it came from, and at the same time still be able to be your own person. But it's the fear that by being my own person, I'm going to be, I'm going to be judged, or I'm going to let people down, or they're going to feel like I betrayed them, any number of different things. That's the internal resistance of like, this is who I know that I am, but I don't know how other people are going to respond to that. And that's where we hold ourselves back because we're so conditioned to care what other people think and what other people make of us, especially parents. All right, there's a lot that we do, like when we have a strong family foundation, those of us who've had the privilege to have that kind of family dynamic, the idea of deviating from the things that we learned, and the idea of potentially, letting our parents down, or not meeting their expectations that they had for us, that can be something that feels very intense, for us. And at the same time, if you don't come clear and find that resolution with them, then you're always going to be betraying yourself, and that matters in the long run a lot, right?
It does, absolutely. And I think you touched on before the relationship aspect, right? And the relationship is not between a mom and a son, a mom and a daughter, a wife and a husband, and a son-in-law and a father-in-law. There's a lot of relationships going on, right? But then one does not confirm and say, hey, my identity is going to change in 5 years. Are you going to still have the relationship with me? For me, I see that, can somebody commit to that kind of statement? I'm going to change in 5 more years, depending on how environment changes. Are you going to still okay with my new rituals, new patterns of behaviors I'm expressing through the day? Because that's going to be me, depending on the opportunities. Are you going to be okay still supporting me, standing by me? Right. And that's an important factor because, to your point before, once you are in a new society, you're going to be mixed up with cultures, and therefore you have to behave certain way to get the best outcomes for yourself, right? Which brings you joy or happiness. In that sense, the identity shift can happen, and maybe the relationships may not work in that sense.
Yes,
You
absolutely.
almost think that I have changed, but this person did not understand me. But then, well, have you had a contractual agreement saying that it's I'm going to change, but you're still going to be okay? Not so. And I think that's where we need to have that acceptance of truth, that our identity can shift. It's a continuous shift,
I think a lot of us, I see this in movies so much. This is going to be such a cliche thing that we see in movies, but it's like when somebody dies, And usually you hear the line, things will never be the same. And it's the expectation that things were always going to be the same. That's the problem, right? It's not, sure, this person's, passing is sad and all these different things, but our attachment to this idea that no change is good. Things will always be the same. This is how things are supposed to be. It sets us up for disappointment at least, and complete like disarray at worst when things do change and we have to figure out how to adapt to that change, right? So again, like back to the pandemic, that was a huge change for most of us, for in a lot of different ways. Health behavior, um, relationship, dynamic, employment dynamic, right? Working from home versus what does that mean? All of these different things. And we when we look at things like in organizations like change management, why is it hard? It's because people are not committed to change as being a constant in their life. And it's the one thing that is constant. Change is the constant throughout human evolution, right? It's no different now than it was, 300,000 years ago. It is our desire for things to stay the same, and this kind of nostalgia, I feel like, versus being open to change is a good thing. If we're moving, if we're changing, we're evolving, we're expanding in a positive direction, that is what we should be seeking. But we often, it's not the future that we want is always possible if we're willing to accept that there are things that need to change as a result, that things will change as a result. But you can't have both at the same time. They're incompatible, right? And I feel like that's one of those things. How do you help people to embrace change?
I think that's a beautiful question, right? For me, it's also a question internally I have to ask myself all the time, like embracing change. Um, the our mindset has to constantly think the environmental conditions and the behaviors we're trying to express, right? Take an example of I was last 2 days ago, I was in New York City, like doing a seminar. It was, woke up at 4 o'clock, did all my work, and 5:30 I took a train, and then I kind of reached there at 7 o'clock. I was supposed to be there at 6:45, but the people were very nice and they accommodated me. And I did my seminar. It was 9 o'clock. I left, and by the time I came, it was the last train, 10:30 from NJ Transit. It was 11 o'clock. At Princeton Junction, they would only stop one door. They would only open one door, and there were a couple of older people with heavy luggage trying to get from all the way from 6 7 cars to the front car, because you can't get down in every car, every door. And they were trying to help, and I'm like so tired, and I thought, let me help them, because it's okay if I miss the train, because it's 11:30. I still have to make it to work in the morning and all that. But and the lady was older lady, and she was so happy that she said thank you and bless you and all that. I said I would have done, if my luggage is there, I would have done the same thing, right? So I have, sometimes you have to think from other person's perspective, to let it go of your own self, right? So talking about that change, are you adaptable for a common cause? Let's say my work, I'm working for the patients at the end, right? I'm adaptable. I'm, even if I switch organizations, even if I switch in a different role, lateral move, promotion, whatever it is, we are still working for a common cause together. So taking that change, taking that leap of faith is okay. Being uncomfortable promotes growth, and having that mindset is absolutely give you more experiences in your life, right? So for me, life is about experiencing something, like, because at the end of 80 90, hopefully I live that long, that, and then what do I write in my storybook is that experiences, right? Okay, I helped an old lady in the train. I know my person who picks up trash in my company, whose name is Victor, and I speak to him in Spanish, "¿Cómo estás?" and the few words I know. But those behaviors are important as we try to change ourselves and see the change within others. And maybe I should quote this, like, be the change you want to see in the world. That's what Mahatma Gandhi said, right? So it all starts with me before I try to influence the change on somebody else.
Absolutely. I love that. That's a very that's one quote that I always have in my mind. And when I learned it the first time, I thought this makes total sense. We cannot expect other people to be the ones to change things, to fix things, to come and apologize to us, whatever the situation may be. Like, we have to resolve that within ourselves. There's this wonderful book that I absolutely love, and I feel like it's my it's my personal growth Bible. It's called The Four Agreements. And one of those, so there's four different agreements, and the author talks about how we unconsciously like commit to these ways of being in a way that it causes us a lot of grief. And so but one of these agreements is always do your best. That is going to change from day to day. But can you really reflect at the end of the day, did I do my best today? And if I didn't, maybe I yelled at my kid, maybe I, cut somebody off in traffic, maybe, whatever the case may be. If you can reflect on that and go, ugh, that was not my best. I'm going to practice some self-compassion and realize, you know what, I was stressed and it was still not okay to do it. But at that moment, that's what I did. How can I be better tomorrow? What can I do to improve on this? Especially if it's a repetitive pattern, right? Because when and it's uncomfortable, is we have to face ourselves, right, in the mirror and go, was that really my best? Okay, I can't really excuse that. Okay, well, what do I need to do? And not with self-judgment, because self-judgment is never a good. Self-judgment can move you into action, but not in a positive way, right? Self-compassion and just recognizing I am a human, and as a human being, I am imperfect, and also I can do better, right? It can still move you to change, but with a more expansive, positive state of mind that matters not just for who we're becoming, but also for how we are collectively becoming, right? And I feel like that's an important part of kind of where we are in human society right now.
No, I think that's great, because I keep telling myself vulnerability is the new strength, right? Being vulnerable is totally okay. Why not? I mean, we face that situation within our family, and we sometimes cry, maybe tears of joy, say sorry to each other. Why can't we be like that to the world also? And I think the world will uplift you if you are saying, I don't know how to do this, can you help me out? And that's why that maybe I was fortunate enough to see that letting it go, and then finding the change within, finding that mindset within myself, the inner nature. And then you have tons of joy, because everybody is trying to you know have that relationship with you. you know and that's where the experiences count. And talking about culture and society, you are building that culture within yourself, and within the environment as well, to be able to embrace each other, right, and uplift each other. So that's, to me, which was very profound.
I love that. So we touched on a lot of different things today in our episode. So we certainly started from this place of culture and society and how it could affect our mindset, but there are so many different ways in which that can happen. And we talked about so many different examples, right? The even like moving to another country, that being a big thing, right? Understanding the things that we learn versus trying to like really like separate that from who we actually are as individuals, and how do you learn to do that. We talked about what the importance of being uncomfortable with ourselves and having that personal responsibility and that growth, right, to be the change that we want to see in the world. I feel like we are, you know, in a place, certainly in our conversation, but in our world, where it matters for us to embrace change, especially change within ourselves, positive change, so that we can see others with more empathy, but also so that we can create the kind of world that we actually want to live in. Right? I think we can all agree that there are a lot of injustices, or a lot of things that are happening in our world today, in our own society, in our own homes, whether that's domestic violence, whether that is, war, whether, whatever magnitude of a problem it is. At the end of the day, there are things that I think we can agree with, that we don't want. We don't want war. We don't want people dying. We don't want children to suffer. I think we can all agree on having those shared values and beliefs, that we all deserve to be healthy, to be safe, right? And in order to do that, we have to first start with healing our own hurts, our own wounds, and being able to see others as full, whole human beings, the way that we want to be seen as whole human beings, right?
It's
Is there
beautifully said.
anything? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's beautifully said, Margie.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining our bi-weekly podcast. We hope that you join us again every Wednesday at 1 p.m.